Good afternoon, distinguished guests, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kishore Mahbubani. I'm the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. It gives me great pleasure to invite you to this public lecture by Mr. Paul Volcker. You know, one of the advantages I've had, having served as ambassador for many years, is that I have met many great men in my life. But I can honestly say today that of the many, many great men I have met in my life, Mr. Paul Volcker is one of the greatest men I've ever met. Paul will not remember this, but I first met him I think in 1983 or 84, when he was still chairman of the Fed. And at that time, the then Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, happened to be visiting Washington, D.C. And, you know, I was in awe of Dr. Goh Keng Swee, Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore. When we walked in to call on Paul Volcker, I could see that Dr. Goh Keng Swee was in awe of Paul Volcker. So someone whom you are in awe is in awe of somebody else. And, you know, he said to me, Dr. Goh said to me, Kishore, you have no idea how powerful this guy is. When he walks out of a meeting, whether or not he smiles or frowns, millions get lost in the market. But let me tell you a bit of his life story, okay? He became chairman of the Fed in August 1979, indeed at a very difficult time for the American economy. Inflation was at over 13% annually. The value of the dollar was falling, and financial markets were concerned about renewed inflation. In fact, the same kind of bad days that we are experiencing now. But his tough and concerted measures resulted in ending this crisis. And in his 8 years as chairman of the Fed, Paul Volcker's most remarkable achievement was, of course, to reverse these inflation trends in the U.S., for which basically he's been recognized as one of the greatest economic leaders of all time. But writing about Paul Volcker in 1987 in Time magazine, Stephen Cope said, and I quote, he had profound impact on a $4.3 trillion economy, but he lived in a tiny $500 a month apartment furnished with cast-offs. He ran his agency in a notably serene and straightforward style, and still his mystic grew so potent that his every move sent global financial markets into spasmodic guessing games about what he was thinking, unquote. And as a result of his chairmanship and subsequently, the chairman of the Fed emerged as essentially the second most person in Washington, D.C. The Fed's primary motivation, of course, is to address the problem of banking panics. It also serves the central bank for the United States. Fortunately, all the efforts to deregulate were not successful, and he preserved the Fed as a very strong institution. Before coming to the Fed, he was educated at Princeton, Harvard, and LSE, and he started his career at the Fed in 1952. Over the next 2 decades, he worked with the Chase Manhattan Bank and the U.S. Treasury Department, returning in 1975 back to his first job at the Federal Reserve Bank, New York, as president. He left in August 1979 when he was appointed by President Jimmy Carter as the chairman of the Fed and reappointed in 1983. Prior to his illustrious career at the Fed, Volcker became chairman of the prominent New York investment banking firm Wolfenson and Company. He has chaired the board of trustees of the International Accounting Standards Committee and the Independent Inquiry Committee of the United Nations Oil for Food Program. He is currently the chairman of the trustees of the Group of 30 and a member of the Trilateral Commission. But most remarkably of all, despite his many global obligations, The reason why he's in Singapore today is because he has found the time to attend a meeting of the governing board of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And for this, Paul, we thank you very much for giving your time to our school. And as you all know, and I know this is why you are here, we are in the middle of a great crisis. Let me just quote what he said in the Wall Street Journal last Friday. He said, and I quote, "We have the tools to manage the crisis. Now we need the leadership to use them." Let me now produce the leader, Mr. Paul Volcker.
Thank you, Kishore. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to put all those kind comments in some kind of perspective. The reason that he goes overboard in this introduction is my part-time job is writing blurbs for Kishore Mahbubani's latest books, and that keeps me busy. You know, when I agreed to give this lecture with this great title, Reflections on the World Economy, you know, it sounds like some expansive, thoughtful review of the history and the outlook. I'm not sure events in recent days give me much chance for a thoughtful review of history and the outlook. Things are moving, as you well know, very rapidly in the financial world. There are many questions about the outlook, not much time for reflection. I left New York on Friday with the markets collapsing. I appear here now on Tuesday when the markets are booming. It's a little hard to keep track of it. I've been around for a while. I've seen a lot of crises, but I've never seen anything quite like this one. It's well beyond any influence from either frowning or smiling or any other expression, Kishore. Who could imagine, you know, that in the space of the past week, the stock markets have had a record decline. The great symbol of all this, if there was any symbol and substance to the great new financial system that's developed in the last couple of decades, it's the great investment banking houses, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, Bear Stearns, Lehman, all gone, at least all gone in their past stage. It's really remarkable. In the United States, we had those two big mortgage companies that accounted for about half of all the mortgage lending in the United States, which is a huge figure, now run by the government. We've got this pattern now over the weekend of governments in all the developed world buying into, promising to, actually investing, partially nationalizing the biggest commercial banks in the world. It's quite a change. And I do believe that, as Kishore said, that the governments now have the tools to deal with this situation, this eroding situation, a situation coming close to a panic in the marketplace. We do have the tools available, and we begin to see them used very vigorously. One of the changes that we've seen just in the past week or so is a recognition on the part of governments all over the world that this is a common problem. It may have started in the United States, but it's not confined to the United States, and it's going to take cooperative action among all the developed countries. They've all decided quite clearly they would protect by one means or another the major banks. And you see that process underway. There are all kinds of deposit guarantees, insurance for deposits of banks, and in some cases other institutions. It amazes me that the United States is insuring money market funds, a fairly recent development over a couple of decades that was proudly unregulated and uninsured. It is now guaranteed. We've had governments intervening in other markets. The United States is preparing to intervene in the mortgage market itself. We see enormous amounts of liquidity being dispensed by central banks in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere. We have, one of the kind of hidden things that isn't in the headlines, but it may be one of the more important things, is this market for so-called credit default swaps, an enormous market that's grown up in recent years. Nobody quite knew what would happen if you actually had some credit defaults, but urgent efforts are now underway to improve the settlement and clearance systems to help remove that threat from the marketplace. Now, all those measures that I describe, I have to tell you, after a career in finance and in the marketplace, in private finance, mostly in government finance, these kinds of measures of government guarantees and intervention are really distasteful. They're not consistent with the kind of open private markets that you associate with a well-functioning capitalistic system. But however distasteful, I'm afraid that they were necessary in this emergency to restore some sense of stability and confidence in financial markets. But let me say, if I take a medical analogy, financial system may be in the emergency ward right now. And then it's going to move into intensive care. I think we're moving into the intensive care analogy, but I'm afraid it's going to have to be there for a considerable period of time before it returns to normal. I do think that that can happen, and that with the kind of really determined commitment that we have for governments now, we can avoid what seems to be an inevitable recession in the United States, I'm afraid in Europe as well, into something that is manageable, not too long in depth and in length, but it is a serious matter. Now, we look at this, I think it takes some understanding about what went wrong and why. I think we all are aware that the free financial markets always have a good deal of volatility. They have recurrent crises, and we've had a number of crises, 5, 6, 7 in the last 25 years, but we've always managed to overcome them without great damage to the real economy. Now, this crisis is an exception to that. I don't think we can escape damage to the real economy, and as I suggested, I think we almost inevitably face a considerable recession. And I think that is true because this is not just a financial crisis that arose out of the blue, so to speak, arose out of the internal dynamics of the financial market, but it's as serious as it is because it reflects some disturbing and really unsustainable trends in the world economy. And I must say in this case, particularly in the American economy. And these trends have developed in the brand new 21st century. And I think to a degree, these problems were foreseeable. And just to suggest my bona fides in that way, I want to read to you a quotation from a speech I made in 2005, 2.5 years ago. And I'm quoting, "There are really disturbing trends, huge imbalances, disequilibria, risks, call them what you will. Altogether, the circumstances seem to me as dangerous and as intractable as any I can remember, and I can remember quite a lot. I don't know whether the change will come with a bang or a whimper, whether sooner or later. But as things stand, it's more likely than not that it will be a financial crisis rather than policy foresight that will force the needed changes. Well, here we are in a forecasted financial crisis. What were those disequilibrium risks that I mentioned a couple of years ago? I think the key point is that the United States, which stands as the largest, strongest, richest economy in the world, had come to spend every year more than it was capable of producing. And when you spend more than you're producing, the result in open markets is a current account deficit, and that current account deficit came to range to 5 to 7% of our GNP, over $500 billion year after year. Another way of saying it is we became dependent upon, addicted to, borrowing from abroad. And we weren't borrowing to finance investment. We weren't even borrowing to finance the government deficit, which was not all that big. We were borrowing to sustain an exceptionally high level of consumption. Normally, consumption in the American economy ran about 2/3 or a little less of the GDP. In recent years, it's been running 70% or so, almost 5% above its normal historic level. And that was, rather comfortable. People like to consume in the United States, if you didn't realize that before. And people lent us the money. We didn't have to go around the world with a begging bowl. People were eager to hold dollars. They were eager to lend us money. They were quite happy because the other side of that was they were running big trade surpluses to feed the United States consumption binge. So we were relatively happy consuming. China, other Asian countries were happy to export and happy to hold dollars. And so it was quite comfortable, and that's why nobody really wanted to do anything about it. There was only one little trouble: it couldn't go on forever. It went on as long as it did, and this is the connection with the financial crisis, because there were financial developments that seemed to support and enhance this basic disequilibrium. We had extraordinary gains in the stock market in the 1990s, and that made people feel wealthier, made them feel they didn't have to save so much because they had the paper profits in the stock market. But of course that came to an end when the high-tech bubble exploded in the early part of this century. But then all the supply of money from abroad, American policy itself, led to low interest rates, ease of credit creation, and when the stock market declined, we had a new source of seeming comfort. The biggest source of assets in the United States and in other countries is housing. And we went on a new binge of housing construction, housing purchases, and large increases in house prices. So people felt that they could go on consuming because their largest single asset, their house, and 70% of the people in the United States own houses, was increasing in value. Now that took some fancy financial footwork to sustain the rising house price and the rising house construction. Without going into all the details, you know about the phenomenon of subprime mortgages, where people began lending, it was institutions, lending money, institutions in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere, lent money indirectly to American homeowners who couldn't afford the mortgage. That the idea of down payments didn't quite disappear, but almost disappeared. The idea of a close credit check did almost disappear for that market of subprime mortgages, which went from practically nothing 3 or 4 years ago. Nobody had heard of subprime mortgages, to over $1 trillion by the beginning of 2007. It was, in one sense, a marvel of financial engineering, a wonderful process where the mortgages were created by some kind of a broker, immediately sold to some institution that packaged it with other mortgages, which sold it to another institution that packaged the packages together, and another institution split up the packages and sold them to a variety of eager capital providers. And somehow it was going to turn bad mortgages into AAA credits, at least in some substantial proportion. It was a wonderful system that went on, of course, until housing prices finally peaked a couple of years ago, and then they began to decline. As they declined, the basic mortgages went bad, and all this complicated system of intermediaries came to come unraveled. Just to illustrate some of the complications of this market, well, the subprime mortgage market went from practically nothing to $1.25 trillion. We had this other market in CDSs, CDS, credit default swap. What is a credit default swap? Well, it's kind of a handy insurance policy. You pay somebody a little money. If he pays you the amount of the bond you hold that is in default. Well, it was a pretty simple concept. And we ended up in 2007 with $60 trillion worth of default swaps outstanding. That happens to be 7 or 8 times the amount of credit outstanding. So we had protection at some considerable margin over the amount of credits that could possibly default, which I would suggest to you indicates that that market had become something of a gambling casino rather than an insurance policy. People made up the credit swaps on either side, or buy and sell them, in speculation about how they might change. Now, in retrospect, it seems to me had warnings enough that financial markets have become sort of a Potemkin village. What do I mean by that? A fragile edifice, disguising a weak and vulnerable foundation of credit, particularly that weak and crumbling foundation of subprime mortgages. And when that market for subprime mortgages was undercut by the decline in housing prices, by the rise in foreclosures, the foundation was weakened, and we had a crisis as the Potemkin village began to unravel. Now, looking back, it's an obvious question to ask, who's responsible for all this? What happened? And we can point to the regulatory and supervisory failures. Where were the banking regulators in the United States and elsewhere? Where were the supervisors? And I think that's fair criticism, but on the other hand, a lot of this market developed in those investment firms outside the supervised banking area, or outside at least a closely supervised banking area. In any event, banking supervision is a tough business. It's always behind the curve. It's hard to see what's going on until it's too late. So you might turn your attention to the credit rating agencies. We had all these packaged mortgages, subprime mortgages, sometimes mixed with some other credits. And the packages, in considerable part, were getting AAA credit ratings. It was wonderful, turning subprime credits into AAA. And obviously the credit agencies didn't fully realize the risks that were implied. We have a lot of fingers pointed at so-called fair value accounting, the need to mark security holdings to the market. And when the market collapsed, a lot of people said it was very difficult to mark to a market that's not liquid, in which there are no transactions. An attempt to mark everything to market with strict auditors only led to an accelerating decline in prices. And there's truth in all of that. There's been a lot of reason to wonder about the accounting, about the rating agencies, certainly about banking supervision and regulation. But let me say it's my conviction that there were two underlying enabling conditions at work that were more insidious and more difficult to deal with. First, the words escape my tongue of financial engineering in my remarks. A relatively new profession, and to the profession of mathematicians, very popular. Every leading university in the United States has a department of financial engineering, which attracts a lot of students' interest because there are a lot of jobs on Wall Street and elsewhere as to how to deal with these credit market instruments, mix them up, slice them and dice them, as the expression goes, so that presumably you were eliminating excessive risk, and where there was risk, they would be sold to very sophisticated investors that understood what they were doing. I think in the end it didn't quite work out that way. The complexities were so great that I do not believe the managers of the major financial institutions understood the risks that they were taking. Instead of making things transparent and clear, the complications were so great that the markets became opaque and very difficult to analyze, so that the weaknesses built up without anybody realizing it. My second point, and it's completely complementary to that, is this excessive pattern of compensation. Huge amounts of compensation paid to not just the leaders of finance, but to many of the traders and others. And they had incentives to take risk and not much penalty in absorbing when the risk didn't pan out and they had losses. Great rewards for gains, few penalties for losses. So you had a machine that, in combination with the engineering, exaggerated the movements in the market. Now it's unraveled. So where do we stand? Seems to me clear the first priority is to stabilize the system, and that's what's been going on. It's necessary, even though the cost involved is heavy governmental intrusion in markets that should be private. I think it's not an exaggeration now to say that the large banks around the world, of which there are maybe a dozen, banks that operate in many countries, have large influence, would create great risk if they failed, that those banks have an effect, to put it maybe crudely, but I'm afraid correctly, those banks have been nationalized. Not overtly, but sometimes overtly. But whether overtly or not, when all your liabilities are guaranteed and the government's providing capital, you have made a big step toward nationalization of the private financial markets in large part, something that I'm not aware has happened before in the history of these developed countries. Even the ones that had socialist governments years ago did not nationalize the banks. But that's not the end of the problem. House prices in the United States, the decline of which set off this crisis, are still declining, so there's still more losses to come there. The economy, I do believe, is in recession. And that is going to take a need for stimulus measures on the budgetary front, almost regardless of what condition the budget is in at present, as a lesser evil, bigger deficit to save the economy. There are going to be more bad loans as the recession proceeds. So a quick and a strong recovery may be beyond any reasonable expectation. And we're going to have to learn about and rebuild a financial system from the ground up. As it stands now, the financial system's been rebuilding itself, and what's been happening is that the large independent investment banks no longer exist. The large international commercial banks are ironically getting larger because the small, vulnerable firms that are failing or close to failure tend to be absorbed with government support by the big banks. And then we have in the background, not very far in the background, a proliferation of private funds of various sorts, leverage funds, equity funds, venture capital funds, which have been flourishing and have been pretty well insulated from this crisis. Ironically, the smaller, purely private institutions have emerged out of this crisis by and large in better shape. They are playing a larger role in the economy, and importantly, that's a good thing. They are innovative, they are private, they have little or no regulation, they got flexibility, and that helps keep the economy going. But I have to ask whether that's a stable system, whether politically or economically. A relatively small handful of huge institutions on the government support, I don't think that is an attractive long-range outlook, however necessary at the moment. It doesn't suggest either innovative skills or efficiency, and those big institutions are necessarily, in my mind, full of conflicts of interest. They're lenders, traders, investment advisory people, investors, all at the same time, and there are inevitably conflicts between those roles. And how do we wean them from government support? That is the challenge of the future. After all, after what's happened, there's going to be a presumption, a strong presumption of government support whenever the next problem arises. At the least, I think it implies much stronger regulation and supervision. But as suggested earlier, I don't think regulation and supervision can be a really satisfactory answer. If we're concerned about too heavy a hand of regulation about banks, what about the big hedge funds? What about the equity funds? Can they be permitted to wheel and deal? They be permitted to be the new investment banks in the future without regulation? With excessive risk-taking? The kind of thing that brought down the investment banks? I think not. Which implies an extension of government supervision and oversight. It implies capital limits for leverage funds. It implies liquidity requirements that have not existed. And we hope that that can be done in a reasonable way. But those are problems for the future. The rebuilding is going to be the job of another day, of a new administration in the United States, of central banks, of finance ministries right around the world, working together, thinking together, and that process is now taking place in an emergency environment. It's going to have to continue in a thoughtful rebuilding environment. It's got to draw upon the strength of the private sector, with the risk takers now pretty well chastened. It's going to require a clearer understanding of the risks embedded in financial engineering, a difficult matter itself given that complexity. It's certainly got to require some action with respect to the perverse incentives of compensation that have exalted risk over prudence. So through it all, I think there has to continue to be a recognition of this essential role that free and competitive financial markets play in a vigorous and innovative economic system, and somehow we've got to be sure the dead hand of government doesn't overcome that. We're going to have financial ups and downs. We've had them before. We're going to have them again. Financial crises are inevitable. But I just conclude by saying that I think never again should so much economic damage be risked by a financial structure so fragile, so overextended, and so opaque as the structure we have had in recent years. That is the challenge for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, for that comprehensive, lucid, clear, depressing explanation of what went wrong. And I'm going to begin by asking the first question, but please get ready to ask the questions that because I'm sure Paul will be happy to answer them to you. You gave this very clear warning in 2005. And you said, this cannot last. Something is going to happen. You saw this happening clearly 2.5 years ago. Why couldn't all the other brilliant minds in Wall Street not see what you could see so clearly?
It's not so much a question of brilliant minds. They were making money.
As long as the party is going, as long as the music is playing, let's go to the dance floor. Who said that?
I don't know if you understand this reference, but one of the chairman of the biggest bank, I guess, in the world at that time, in the middle of 2007, last year, when this thing had already started, he was quoted as saying, "So long as the music playing, we're going to dance." There were warnings about. By that time, there were certainly warnings. Yeah. But he felt unable to rein in his own bank because the music was still playing. Yes.
Okay, who would like to ask the next question? Please come to the mic, identify yourself, and pose a short, sharp question. Please go ahead. Yes. You first, sir. And then I see some gentlemen coming. Come to the mics, okay? Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Volcker, thanks for your insightful speech. What are your thoughts about how this crisis is going to affect globalization? And if so, what could leaders do about the possible effects of that?
Can you just identify yourself for the record so he knows? Yeah.
Okay. My name is Raphael Dick. I'm a student at NCR.
Okay.
The question is what the implications of the crisis for globalization. One implication is, of course, that the financial crisis, has reinforced what we knew before, that there is a globalization of finance. And what appeared to be initially an American phenomenon turned out to be a European phenomenon as well. And other countries are affected more or less, but it's certainly an international phenomenon. I may be the optimist on this side, but I don't think you can change that without draconian restrictions, which I don't think anybody is prepared for. The danger is often cited more on the trade side than on the financial side. I think there will be pressures on trade liberalization if a recession persists. But even there, I'm relatively optimistic. I don't think you're going to get more liberalization on trade or finance, but I don't think you're going to go in the other direction either. The trend is in the other direction. These markets are so integrated technologically that the idea of shutting it off is no longer a practical alternative. It's a technological, not a policy issue.
Thank you. Mike over there, please.
Hi.
Go ahead.
My name is Bernard Locke. I'm a currency fund manager. I enjoy the party, like what you mentioned, 2005 until now.
Tell us how much you made.
Yeah. Yeah. But anyway, I have immense respect to you as a central banker, as much as I pay to Mr. Alan Greenspan, one of your successors. My question is, do you think Mr. Greenspan have done a good job? You can select not to answer. Yeah. Thank you.
That's a very difficult question.
I follow a religious rule of not commenting upon my successes. And I'm not going to break that rule right now, but he was in office for a long time. And there were good things that happened during that period, and there were some not so good things, but that's the life of a central banker.
That's a very honorable approach. So I hope you understand. Gentleman over here now.
Hi, my name's Noah, and I'm a graduate student here. And
At NUS.
NUS, yes, of course. Number 30 in the world now, I believe.
Yeah.
My question's in regard to economics in the Austrian School of Economics. I mean, nobody really paid that much attention, and now suddenly the crisis seems to vindicate, the role of the Fed in terms of manipulating or altering the incentives in the economy. And just wondering if there may be a return to that school.
Well, the School of Austrian Economics, I learned about that, I'm trying to think, 62 years ago.
62 years ago. Now you're telling everybody how old you are. He's slightly over 80.
They have some insights that maybe we have forgotten about. Some of the old scholars of the so-called Austrian school. I literally took my first course in economic theory from an Austrian, who was of the Austrian school. But the idea of credit creation being important for one symptom of what was going on has certainly been vindicated, I think. If you look at the statistics in the United States particularly, I think to some extent this would be true in Europe, but it began back when I was chairman of the Federal Reserve. Just at the beginning, the amount of credit in the American economy relative to the GNP has just skyrocketed. I think it used to be more or less the same, and now the amount of credit outstanding is 3 times the GNP, if I remember the figures roughly. And that is reflected in the leverage of the financial firms and the investment banks that have failed, and in commercial banks to some extent, that they all built up the balance sheet on the liability and asset side because of a sense of easy credit and no problems. And that's what's come home to roost. So suddenly they haven't got enough capital to support the credit, which wouldn't surprise most Austrian economists, I suspect.
John Burton, then the gentleman over there. Go ahead.
John Burton with the Financial Times. You were known as the great inflation slayer of the early 1980s. And I'm wondering that with so much money being pumped now into the system, do you see another period of great inflation or stagflation?
Well, I don't see if you're asking me for a straight forecast, I wouldn't make that forecast, but it's not going to be a problem in the short run if the business outlook is as I see it, because inflation doesn't flourish in the face of a recession. But yes, it's something I perpetually worry. I made a speech without mentioning the word inflation. That may be one of the first times in my life that I've done that. But I think it's something we really do have to guard against. But obviously, right now, that's not where the emphasis is.
So not even a period of stagflation then?
Well, we're going to have a period of recession. That's worse than stagflation. I mean, just from the business side, I think it's something we have to worry about when we begin to get out of this recession, without question.
Thank you.
Gentleman over there, then we come to the lady in front. Yeah.
Yeah, Omkar Shrestha from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. You mentioned that, that's something which you had never seen before.
Oh, right.
Exactly at the back.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah. You were mentioning, the partial nationalization of the biggest commercial banks in the West, something which you had never seen. From Asian Development Bank, before I joined the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, I used to go to China, and some of the things, policy dialogue that we used to hold with the government there was the state-owned commercial banks try to privatize it. So they used to go through partial privatization. Later on, I was taken to Vietnam desk, and there again the subject was same, converting the state-owned commercial bank to partial privatization of the banks. So here we have the partial nationalization of the bank, which is going on now, and there the policy dialogue is partial privatization of the bank. Where is the correct mix?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. We have been encouraging...
So China will privatize and the United States will nationalize.
We'll meet in the middle. I don't think the middle is a stable place to meet. So maybe we can learn from the Chinese and the Vietnamese and others how to denationalize effectively.
So you'll have Chinese experts going to Washington, D.C.
No, I do think we have a challenge in restoring a full private environment for finance. And I don't think we're going to learn from the Chinese, actually, but I hope they are not discouraged from increasing the flexibility and privatization of their own financial system.
Thank you. The lady over here, please, before I come to you over there.
I'm Priya Methani from Wigan and Lake College, Mumbai. I'd like to thank you for your very illuminating perspective and ask you, do you think the US economy is headed for what Keynes would have described as a liquidity trap? And how long do you think the recovery would take?
What's been described?
It's been described as a liquidity trap.
Oh.
And how long will the recovery take?
Well, I don't think we're not in a liquidity trap at the moment. If you think of that in the way I learned about it in the non-Austrian school, you have low interest rates or zero interest rates, but the economy is so depressed nobody wants to borrow. The problem now is nobody wants to lend, not that nobody wants to borrow. And that's quite arguably I wouldn't call it a liquidity trap, but I understand that even people that have liquidity don't want to lend. But it's not because there are no borrowers. When you thought of the liquidity trap, it was because the economy was so depressed, nobody wanted to borrow. We're not there. I hope we never get there. So there is a problem in restoring confidence and trust so that people are willing to lend, and indeed people are willing to borrow. And we're in a trust gap or a confidence gap. I believe, I wouldn't call it a liquidity trap, but it is true that the central banks are trying to push out liquidity, and that's not making people lend. And we're there. That's why you've got to restore some confidence. When the big banks aren't even willing to lend to each other, you've got a problem.
And the second question was, how long will this last?
Well, I denied that it was a liquidity trap. Well, whatever it is now, whatever you call it now, all these efforts are aimed toward relieving it in the short run. No, it's not going to go away. But it's got to begin with restoring confidence that the big banks will lend to each other and lend to smaller banks and lend to their principal customers. And that's what this intrusion of governmental capital and deposit protection are all aimed at. And hopefully that process is beginning now, but we'll see. There's a lot of effort, a lot of money and a lot of guarantees are being put into the market to produce that result soon.
Thank you. Gentleman over here, please.
Yes, sir, I'm Kee Soon, finance controller for a Dutch company. I'd like to find out regarding the US dollars. It has always been known as the safe haven currencies. But after this upheaval in US, do you foresee that to be the case?
Remember, whatever you say will change the value of the dollar, you know.
Yeah. Not anymore. Those are the good old days, or the bad old days. Look, I would say the same thing about the dollar as the inflation question. I worry about inflation, I worry about dollar. That's in my DNA. And it will remain in my DNA. But one of the interesting and in some ways reassuring things is that when you have the American financial system under so much attack and understandable attack, and then I suppose you'd have to say a weakened position, and the prospect anyway of a recession, the dollar is not weakened, it's strengthened. So it's the old question of where do people go when they're uncertain and are looking for safety and confidence, which involves more than interest rates and the economy. It involves some feeling about the strength of the country and all the rest. But we should never lose that. I hope we never lose it, but we haven't lost it yet. And, you know, one of the things that's kind of interesting, people begin looking at the exposure of various countries and their banks relative to the size of the economy. And it turns out that, well, this is a big problem, big financial problem in the United States. Very big institutions are involved, a lot of money is involved. In terms of the size of the American economy, it's smaller than many other countries, including many European countries. So maybe that's part of the reason why people don't look at that statistic, but there's a feeling that, you know, the weight of the United States is an economy, and it's, you know, record in terms of rule of law and government stability and so forth, still there.
Okay. Gentleman in front and the gentleman at the back. Let's go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon, Dr. Paul Volcker. My name is Kok Leong. I'm a prospective student for Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy next year.
Wonderful. You're all encouraged to apply, by the way.
Whether you're a real student or not depends upon how intelligent your question is.
And he's on the board.
Okay, Dr. Paul Volcker, what I want to ask is, well, there's a saying called short-term pain, long-term gain, or, you know, you have a, well, short-term gain, long-term pain. Well, there's a lot of debates going on about whether you should let the unfit banks fail because they are unfit. Well, as you prop it up, maybe there will be some problems that is holding back. So what do you see? What's your point of view?
Well, I think governments have obviously made the decision, which I think is absolutely reasonable, that they could not afford to take the risk of a large bank failing, that the short-term pain would be great enough so it would probably undermine the chances of long-term gain. And I think that is a reasonable judgment. The opposite judgment was kind of an experiment with Lehman when that was one of the big investment banks was allowed to fail. And that had, I think, only reinforces the view that I just expressed. Now the problem is when you do this, it has repercussions, and in the future, presumably, you've got this great moral hazard question of people saying, look, these big banks got protected once. And even if the stockholders were not protected, the creditors were. So in the future, the creditors may take more comfort. And to the extent the creditors are not vigilant, then I don't think it's going to happen very soon, but it encourages less than prudent practices on the part of the lenders. That's, I think, a problem, but it's not, for better or worse, it's that long-run problem is not going to dictate what you do today.
Gentleman in the back.
By the
way, we have half an hour to go, so if you don't mind, keep all your questions short and sharp, so you can get everybody in. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Mabubani. Mr. Paul Volcker, I would like to ask a question on the economic issue between China and U.S. The inconvertibility of the renminbi is a perennial source of friction between China and the West. In my view, it is not so much the case of China being unfair in the foreign exchange policy, leading to huge trade surplus in favor of China, as it is the case of China's awareness of the wizards of Wall Street financial dealers employing the ingenious strategic maneuverability of the mechanism of free trade, which can wipe out mercilessly for their own benefit years of...
I'm sorry, you have to just pose your question, please.
All right, yes. So my question is it fair, appropriate, and timely now to reinstate the gold standard currency, be it US dollars, renminbi, euro dollars, Japanese yen, or even Singapore dollars?
Well, the short answer to that is no.
No gold standard.
There are dreams of the gold standard, and I am not opposed to more fixed exchange rates or more stability in exchange rates, but I don't think you can get there by means of the gold standard these days. There's not enough confidence in gold, I guess, in the stability of gold anyway. But I don't think I see no countries that are prepared to undertake that obligation. But since you talked about China, let me just say one thing. I talked about the United States overspending, too much consumption, and all the rest. And it sounds very critical of the United States, and I am critical of the United States to a considerable extent, but there's another side to that coin, and particularly in China. The United States is spending 70% of its GNP on consumption. China is spending, I think, 35% of its GNP on internal consumption, which seems to me way too low, and that is part of the reason you had this imbalance and you had this great ease of lending by China and some other countries to the United States. And if they had a better balanced economy, it would have helped. If we had a better balanced economy, it would have helped. But it wasn't just the United States. Our imbalance was matched by their imbalance.
Thank you. Gentleman over here, please. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Alex Kennedy. I'm a reporter with Associated Press. My question is, during your speech you mentioned that you expect in the US and Europe to face or are facing a considerable recession. By that, do you mean that it will be deep in the sense that over the next 12 months GDP will contract more than 2%? Or do you mean that it will be long, which is to say that there will be a recession for the next 2 years, or God forbid, both?
I will confine my comment to saying I believe we are entering a recession of unknown duration.
That's a safe response.
All right, thank you.
Okay, gentleman over here.
Hi, my name is Saad. I'm just a student at the LKY school. I'm studying public policy. This is actually a question that we've been discussing in our class as well, with reference to the International Monetary Fund's International Economic Outlook that they just published, I think, a few days ago. In that, they mentioned that the crisis is not actually as bad as everybody's, saying that it is. For example, housing prices will reach the lowest at the beginning of next year, and the world economy as a whole will grow. Its growth will slow down to 3%. The developing countries don't have much to fear about this, whereas developed countries will grow at around 0.5% for the next few years. My question is, what is your comment or take on this economic outlook presented by IMF a few days ago?
What's your comment on the IMF economic outlook, which said that world growth will not be too bad, it will be about 3%, and good times are still going? You don't seem to agree with the IMF.
I'm not a prophet, and I make few. No, I don't know about these figures. Obviously, the emerging economies are doing much better, have been, than the developed economies. But how that all balances out in the end, I don't know.
Takes a very wise man to say, I don't know.
They have a big, expensive economic staff. I'm me, reading the newspaper.
Thank you. Gentleman over here now. Thank you.
Dr. Volcker, my name is Yo Sing Chong, Equities Fund Manager. Let's come back to the subprime problem, the issue from whence all this spiraled. In terms of the quantum of delinquent subprime loans in existence today, there are a couple of figures being bandied about. The IMF, in its papers published on its website 2-3 months ago, put the figure at $1 trillion in terms of delinquent subprime mortgages outstanding. In recent weeks, that figure went up to 1.4 trillion.
Delinquencies?
Delinquent subprime loans.
Delinquent actual on the ground, real mortgages, as opposed to the fluff in the air,
1.4 trillion, yeah.
Which I'll come to later. 1 to 1.4 trillion, the IMF says, and these papers are found on its website. In a rather robust report, the BIS, the Bank International Settlements, and the OECD came up with figures to the tune of 400 billion, which would be approximately 1/3 of what the figures IMF is postulating. The reason used by the BIS and OECD is to the tune of improper use of mark-to-market accounting, which they irreverently termed mark-to-myth. So first question, these figures on the ground, 400 billion as compared with 1 trillion, 1.4 trillion, do they mean anything at all in the light of what we are looking at today? Could you care to comment on these figures? Second question is it relevant, given the 60 trillion quantum of CDSs and CDOs that you cited earlier, is it relevant whether it's 400 billion or 1 trillion in the face of this whole plethora of 600 trillion CDOs and CDSs? Second question. Third question.
You've got too many questions for me already.
I'll hold the third question until you finish the first two. Is that okay?
I'm not going to give you much of an answer to the first question. Look, I literally have no statistical staff, and I don't pore over these figures. My understanding was a year ago that the total quantum of so-called subprime mortgages would be about $1.25 trillion, or a little more. Now, we can't have more delinquencies than there are subprime mortgages, I don't think. We can't have more delinquencies than subprime. But there's another class of mortgages in the jargon called alternate A, which is a few $100 billion more. They're better than subprime, but not as good as ordinary. They all can't be delinquent. A growing number of them are delinquent, but I can't tell you how many.
But do these figures matter given the
I don't understand how they could be that. I don't understand the $1.25 trillion figure. But it's an IMF figure. They undoubtedly have some grounds for it. What there was another question.
The sixth question was if it's 1.2 trillion even in subprime mortgages, but you have $60 trillion in credit default swaps.
Oh yeah, the credit
So
default.
does this 1 trillion figure matter?
Yes.
He does.
Because the subprime mortgages are a fact. I mean, they're sitting there. When they get delinquent, there's a loss. The 60 trillion credit default swaps are not exactly a fiction, but they are a derivative. A lot of people, they became a trading game. And undoubtedly, most of that 60 trillion is offset by buyers and sellers. They're hedged against each other. A lot of them could be netted, the same person will hold both sides. And if you netted all those figures, which you're doing now, the figure would get much smaller. Somebody suggested to me the other day that 60 trillion may be down to 45 trillion, simply because people are going through this process. And there's a lot more process, but they're quite different numbers. There's always a gain and a loser on the credit default swap, if it goes bad or goes right. When the mortgage defaults, it's all loss. So they're different. You can't compare them.
So if I may pick up the thread of your logic, Dr. Volcker, is it possible, and here's a bold policy move for your consideration, is it possible to treat the CDSs and CDOs that thrive to the tune of 45 to 60 trillion, or in that ballpark, is it possible to treat those things like the wool on a sheep, and we shear it off, and the sheep will continue to live well without its wool? Is it possible to recognize that in the real world economy, where IMF has already provided for 100% delinquency on all outstanding home loans, and of course you cannot have more delinquencies than what you have in existence, right. You yourself said that, is it possible to walk away from the wool, leaving the sheep to thrive well?
The problem is we don't know in the case of the credit default swaps. And you just write them all off. There are a lot of people that would gain and some people would lose. And how much what that difference is, you don't know. That's a big uncertainty. If you ask a different question, could we have a financial system without credit default swaps? The obvious answer is yes. We ran such a financial system up until 5 years ago. I don't think we're dependent upon a market for credit default swaps in the financial system. And my view is it caused more trouble than it was worth. The famous remark of Warren Buffett that they're weapons of mass financial destruction.
Okay, you have to move on. Gentleman over there, then you go around the vice session. Please go ahead in the back. Yes.
Me?
Yes.
My name is Arun Desai and I do social work. In a sense, I'm quite a layman in what is being discussed, but one of the questions I'd like to ask Mr. Volcker is, on the 15th of September, when Lehman filed for bankruptcy, Fed had the problem of Lehman and AIG.
Had the problem of?
Lehman
the Fed had the problem of Lehman and AIG at the same time.
AIG on the same day.
Yes.
Just in case the Fed had saved Lehman, would we have a situation today where the world would not have faced in the last fortnight what has happened?
Well, they did save Lehman. They lent them $85 billion.
No, Lehman.
Oh, not Lehman, I'm sorry, AIG. So if they'd rescued Lehman, you're asking me a question I do not know the answer to.
Should they have, if they had saved Lehman?
No, if they saved Lehman, what would have happened? And you can say the failure of Lehman obviously helped disturb people in the end and added to uncertainty. But if they'd saved them the same way they saved, let's say, Bear Stearns, that also did not create a lot of confidence. The fact that they failed, whether or not they got saved, undermined confidence. Now, is it more this way or less, or it's water under the dam?
Thank you.
Lady over there, please. Yes.
I'm Ramya from DBS Bank. My question to you is, you trace the root of the crisis to US overconsumption and of course the US property market bubble. But global liquidity has been abundant for a long while, and that's been termed as a global savings glut, for example. So in your view, what is the chance that a lot of the property markets around the world are in some kind of a bubble? And what does that mean for banking sectors globally? And I mean, all estimates of losses, for example, right now we have it mainly from the subprime market. But if what we have is a global savings glut and a global bubble, then what does that mean?
I don't know, all you people think I got more capacity to know all these things than I do. It's your fault, Kishore. You made them think I know all the answers.
You're supposed to be a wise man, you know. I'm just the moderator.
No, but let me say one thing, because I just want to... I know I may have given the impression you started with, which is partly true and what I wanted to convey about American overconsumption. But it was the imbalance, that underlying imbalance in our overconsumption, Asia's underconsumption, was important underlying factors. But what made the crisis was the financial engineering and the compensation practices and all the rest that went on that enabled that disequilibrium to continue in a way that finally created the crisis. So that was the underlying background was important, but the crisis in a more immediate sense was because of weaknesses within the financial system. Now, I can't answer your question about I think the extreme example of a kind of bubble was the so-called subprime market in the United States. We have had real estate problems both in the UK and Spain, to name two countries. But they're much smaller than the United States, and I don't think the weakness in the mortgage financing was not as great. But we do have, obviously, we currently have little bubbles. So I can't say anything else.
Thank you. No, I'm sorry. I have to apologize because I can see there's 7 people waiting in the next 15 minutes, so I have to apologize to you and go to the next question.
Are we got a time limit here?
Yeah, we're going to finish in 15 minutes. We've got 7 questions. Go ahead, please, gentlemen.
It's a great honor to be in this public lecture. My name is Ronnie Lai. I'm in business consulting. My question is, the global government have been injecting huge and fresh funding into the financial markets. And the highly respected investment guru, Jim Rogers, have been arguing that government shouldn't do this. It should let the free market reorganize itself. Does his argument make sense to you, sir? Number 2, the global crisis need global solution. 24th October happens to be UN's Day, United Nations Day. Should the United Nations play a part in tackling this global financial crisis? In your opinion, what could the UN do? Thank you.
Nothing. Let's leave the UN out of it. I learned that from Kishore. That's no,
I agree with him. Let's not get the UN involved in financial crisis.
It's not the UN field, but the UN has enough problem resolving anything in its field. But I thought I made clear the answer to what I understand your first comment was, should this have been left to just a free market? I think the risks of that were too great. I mean, the governments have obviously decided that, but I have no disagreement with that they had to intervene. I'm sorry about that, but and I think it's going to be hard to disintervene, so to speak. But I don't think they have much alternative.
Thank you. Gentleman over here.
I'm John Janner. I'm a reporter with Dow Jones. You mentioned in response to someone else's question that the problem we're facing right now is not a liquidity trap, which would suggest monetary easing would be effective. You also mentioned that we are not, that at the moment inflation is not anywhere near as great an issue as the recession that you say we're now in. And yet you mentioned fiscal stimulus as a step that the U.S. government could take. Do you also anticipate that the Federal Reserve and other central banks will pursue further monetary easing in the next few months?
Well, I'm going to leave that up to them, but let me make two comments. This question about the liquidity trap, I gave an unduly technical answer to, because I think of liquidity trap in the classic sense that I mentioned, that it's just a question of labeling. There is undoubtedly a question, the central banks are pushing as much money in the market as they can, and people aren't lending it. Now, if you call that a liquidity trap, we're in a liquidity trap. Yes. I just don't want to mix it up with the old kind of liquidity trap, but I don't want to be quoted saying there's no liquidity problem, because there is. And I don't want to comment. I mean, the central banks are able to make up their own mind, and I will continue to let them do so.
Thank you. Gentleman at the back there.
Hi, Dr. Walker. I'm Hari Ramanathan, and I've never been happy to have not been a banker in my life. My question to you is actually a little step back from economics. We've heard everybody here asking about credit swaps and CODs and a lot of jargon. As a man who stayed in a $500 a month rental apartment as the chairman of the largest financial institution in the world, do you think we are trying to find an economic solution to essentially a social and human problem of greed?
Is it fundamentally a social and human problem of greed to which economic solution cannot be found?
Well, there's a problem with greed. If that's the question.
Yeah. You agree it's a problem of greed?
You know, many people have commented this kind of expression, greed is good, which was kind of a mockery 15 years ago, began to be believed in the financial markets in the United States to a degree, but we overdid it to the extent that it's good. I'm reluctant to say, but the thing was rigged so that it was too easy to take risks with immense reward. And if that's greed, it's a big problem.
So, the answer is partly yes.
Yeah, yes, I think.
Gentlemen,
but you're never going to get rid of greed. There's always going to be. How do you control it?
Yeah. Please,
Mr. Chairman, my name is Peter. I practice law in Singapore and in Vancouver. My purpose of coming to this lecture is that, Mr. Chairman, I bought your very useful and expensive book in Vancouver. Do you think Singapore, China, and the greater China bankers are relatively unaffected? This round is due to a cultural reason. Bankers do not understand or do not pretend to understand the complexities of financial derivatives, and we are safe. I try to, Mr. Chairman, could I give some background? I try to unravel the mysteries of financial derivatives with someone from Singapore, first-class honors in economics, MBA from Chicago, CFA, and after 6 months, we could not unravel the complexities of financial derivatives. We would be considered by Wall Street as not too smart, unwise people. Thank you.
So I'm not sure what your question was, but it was...
Well, the question was, do I think bankers in China and Singapore are capable of getting in trouble?
No, is it a cultural issue?
They may not be in trouble, but I think they're capable of getting in trouble.
We are all equally capable. Thank you. Thank you. Gentlemen, please.
Yeah, my name is Shekhar Mulati, and I work for a listed company here in Singapore. My question is around the compensation policies that you mentioned also contributed to this. Going forward, how do you see this changing so that the problem doesn't recur?
That's an easy one.
No, you know, a lot of people are concerned with that question, and I haven't heard any good answers. You will get progress without question, I think, in restructuring compensation practices so that there is less big reward for success in the short run without guarding against lack of success in the longer run. In other words, people won't be given quite so many big bonuses or stock options or whatever this year without regard to what happens next year or the year after and the year after that. I think it's pretty well understood that the arrangements were too short term. I think when you get to the amount rather than the structure, how much they should get paid, I don't think anybody has an answer. I mean, it seems to me they got paid too much, but there's no question in my mind about that. But how you control it, whether there's any way of controlling it other than a good sense of the management of that bank, or institution, whatever it is. But this question is going to be right on, I don't know the answer, but it's right now on the front burner, so to speak, because as the governments have an ownership interest in these banks, so the government has, whether it's ownership or protection, I don't think they can escape consideration of this problem. In fact, American law, the law that was just passed, the $700 billion thing says if the government supports a bank, I don't forget the exact language, it's very vague, but they have to review the compensation practice. And that's about all it says. That's fine. They have to review. Nobody knows how to implement that. But politically, I think for more than political reasons, but politically, in the United States at least, there's certainly a strong feeling and reflected in law that something should be done and nobody knows how to do it.
Thank you. Gentleman over here.
Dr. Paul Volcker, I just one simple question. I am engineer by training, but I still represent the National Trade Union. So I have this simple question. What's your take on the social cohesion among all the players after the music and during the music? That's a very simple question. And after all, you have mentioned so much on the credit bubble, inflations. I think these are all your reflections.
What is the impact on social cohesion at the end of the crisis? Has that created a greater sense of inequality and disparity, or greater sense of solidarity?
Well, it's been interesting in the United States. I only talk about the United States, that we have had more inequality in income. Not only inequality in income, but you've had very little, if any, increase in real income among most of the population in the past 10 or 15 years. And you've had an enormous increase in income by the top 1%. And there's been very little political or other reaction to that. It seemed to have been accepted because I guess there was a feeling that somehow this great wealth at the top was justified in some sense, and that the economy was doing well, as it was, and there was full employment, and so it's okay, it's part of the system. But now, when it's broken down, and presuming we have a recession, there's more noise and debate about this now politically in the last few months than there were in the last few years. And how it's all resolved, I don't know, but it's certainly becoming an issue that it wasn't before. And then you come back to the question of what do you deal with this excessive pay, and nobody knows the answer, as near as I can see.
So the answer is yes, it has had an impact.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman at the back there, we have 3 minutes, and we'll try and get all the questions, but we may not. Please, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, sir, for the speech. I just have 2 questions to ask you. I'm Ian, civil servant in Singapore, and considering this is organized by the LKY SPP, I thought I'll ask 2 questions that's more public policy or possibly public policy related. You mentioned the issue about compensation, and emphasis was on the bank side. However, if I draw the parallel with UK FSA and the issue of Northern Rock, whereby the compensation to the UK FSA employees, or in this particular case, the supervisors in charge of UK FSA, was insufficiently compensated and the turnover was so high, as a result there was a lack of knowledge of the institution or even the product, because you cannot compensate civil servants for the same skill sets that actually engineers all these financial products. So how do you supervise that? So as public policy then, anti-caught in little fix, because on one hand, government, you can't afford that kind of pay scales. On the other hand, you lose these talents to probably the private sector, who just goes right ahead and do their risky stuff. The second question is the issue of moral hazard. You mentioned that earlier as well, and one question I'd like to ask is, you had Merrill Lynch, you had Bear Stearns, you had Lehman, and you had AIG. As policymakers, therefore, the question is, how do you discern when to come in? When the US came in to help Bear Stearns, at the same time helping AIG, but letting Lehman fall. And that's a question which I am trying to learn and grapple as well, because I thought that was a very important lesson, because CEO for Lehman, Mr. Foltz, was making lots of noise and say, where was my bailout, for example, on CNBC. So but it is an interesting question, because if the next guy comes and the next bank faces that problem, how do you resolve the issue of moral hazard?
Two good questions for you.
Well, I haven't resolved the question of moral hazard, except to say that it is, I think, a real problem that has been kind of overcome by the intensity of the immediate crisis. But you come back to this compensation question, which I'm not going to be able to enlighten you on, but it was interesting. If I read the Financial Times a little bit before coming over here, it sounded like the banks that they are putting official capital into have told and insisted that the heads of those banks don't get a bonus and they don't get any separation pay, which would be quite a
change.
Quite a step, yeah. now they weren't paid as much as outrageously as some of these Americans were, but that apparently is the approach of one government at one point in time. You're only going to get your salary, which wasn't all that much, and you're not going to get any separation pay. That is not, we haven't faced it head on in the United States, but those firms that have failed or been merged have continued to pay a big bonus and separation pay. So we'll see. That issue arises with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and so far as I know, it hasn't been resolved yet. But it's in suspense, and we'll see what they do. It's not an easy question.
Yeah. We have actually reached 6 o'clock, but do you mind in just 5 minutes, we get them to, each one posts a short, sharp question.
One thing
and then, so that you all get your questions in, and then I'll record them and remind you. You can quickly go through them. So why don't we quickly finish the 4 questions and make sure everyone gets a chance. A short, sharp question, please. Yes.
My name is Vikram, and I'm a student. Okay, my question to you is, what are your recommendations to tackle a possible recession in Singapore?
Okay, that's the question. Go over there, please.
My answer to that is I haven't got any.
I thought so, but let's get all the questions then. Okay.
Hi, my name is Timothy. I work for a Swiss wealth management company. My question is, should governments be in the business of identifying real estate bubbles and then taking measures to deflate those bubbles rather than letting them grow big and pop?
Okay, next question.
I'm Dr. Lim from FX1 Academy. I'd like to inquire about the future of the currency market in the current scenario, and is in regards to liquidity and also in regards to currency trading. Thank you.
Okay, last question. Yeah, so we got everybody in. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much that I have a chance to ask this last question. I think there's one area which, Mr. Volcker, you may not have mentioned in your speech, which is what is the role of the Fed in this whole financial crisis from the beginning of the housing bubble to where we are. Right? You illustrated or you explained the financial engineering that started with the housing bubble, but I'm not an engineer by training, but you need the raw material. Where does the raw material come from? Right? So if you have a housing bubble, which I take it that you have sustained price increases, and if we go back to Milton Friedman, which argues that inflation cannot be there if there is no monetary accommodation, right? What role did a Fed policy play at the beginning of the crisis, and what role did a Fed policy play that ended the housing bubble and started this crisis? Thank you.
Okay, the first question, what's your answer to the recession in Singapore? The answer is you don't know the answer, okay.
Don't know the answer.
Should the government identify property bubbles?
Don't know the answer.
Don't know the answer. Very easy. The third question was about the current. Okay, seriously, you want to answer the question about property bubbles?
Yeah, well, and the last question was about bubbles too.
Yeah.
I'm not going to have a critique of monetary policy in the past, but on the bubble question, it's a difficult question for monetary policy or the central bank in particular, because these things happen in mini scale all the time, and it creates sometimes a dilemma for policy. But as a general, and maybe not very helpful comment, I would say if your sense is that the bubble, the disequilibrium, gets so large as to have the potential for destabilizing the economy, you can't ignore it in policy, and you should, to the extent you have powers to do so, try to modify the bubble. It's not easy, but if in your judgment, if in the central bank's judgment, it is of a kind that's going to be destabilizing for the whole economy, then you don't ignore it. I don't think you can
The
ignore
question
it.
on the currency market, you want to answer that?
I don't got much to say about the currency market. I mean, it seems there's too much instability in currencies for my taste now, and usually I think there should be reform of the currency market, whether in this crisis or otherwise. There is too much instability, too much passivity in governments, in my view, in terms of managing. In fact, they don't attempt to manage it anymore, the currency markets, and I would think there ought to be a little more. I could give a long lecture on that, but I refrain. I'll make one other comment about central bank. What is going on now, and I think it's clearly in the actions, it's clearly recognized, is all this intervention in the market is on behalf of finance ministries and treasuries, on behalf of governments, because it all does involve a governmental responsibility and the potential and actual expenditure of government funds. And that ought to be done by the government and not be pushed off into the central bank. For the interest of preserving independent central banks, I think that's an important distinction to keep.
Well, I think you all agree that we've been very privileged in the last hour and a half to listen to Paul Volcker. He's a man who's participated in so many crises, and it's wonderful to have his perspectives and his advice for the future. I can tell you that one reason why he agreed to serve on the governing board of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy is because Mr. Paul Volcker passionately believes in public service. He believes it's very important to have good markets, but it's equally important to have regulatory agencies and government agencies that perform as well as markets do, and he's very concerned about the poor compensation in public services and the erosion of the credibility of public institutions. So this is why he supports the strong public service.
That's correct.
This is why he wants all of you to support the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy too. Thank you very much. You don't mind the commercial?